Hi everyone, welcome to DASER Experiments. I'm Jody Talasek, and I'm the Director of Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences. For 9 years, we have hosted DASER, or DC Art Science Evening Rendezvous, in our physical space at the NAS building in Washington, D.C. DASERs are designed to bring experts from diversely different backgrounds into conversations with one another and to provide a networking environment that fosters collaboration and cross-disciplinary practice. Now more than ever, it seems important for us to come together and using all the areas of our expertise to help us imagine the future that we want to live in. In that same spirit, we're going online to experiment with different formats that utilize the tools of the internet. For the next several months, we will gather on the third Thursday of the month to hear conversations between experts who share a common practice of pushing the boundaries of their disciplines. Today's experiment brings to you a conversation between oceanographer and NAS member Jody Deming and artist Adrien Segal. Jody is a professor in the School of Oceanography at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's known for her extensive field work, being involved in over 50 nautical research expeditions. She is a National Academy of Sciences member and a National Academies Keck Futures Initiative, NAKFI, Alumni. She is a co-leader of the Ocean Memory Project, a NAKFI-funded collaborative network of researchers from across the sciences, arts, and humanities, dedicated to exploring the intersection of ocean and memory, as well as advancing ocean memory as a new field of scholarship and creative expression. Adrien Segal is an artist and data sculptor based in Oakland, California. She works across disciplines and media, including cast glass and bronze, wood, marble, metal, clay, drawing, and even digital prints. She is an adjunct professor of furniture design at the California College of the Arts, San Francisco, and her exhibit, Force Majeure Wildfire and Wheat, is currently installed at the National Academy of Sciences, although the building is temporarily closed due to the pandemic. Before we begin, a little information about today's format. We've pre-recorded the first part of the conversation so that Adrien and Jody can visit with you directly in the Zoom chat. The chat feature can be found at the bottom of your screen. After the conversation, our guests will come online live to continue the discussion in real time. Those of you who have joined us before at the physical DASER events know that we do something called Community Share at the beginning of the program. This is where you and the audience are able to share, introduce yourself, and to talk about your cross-disciplinary work, as well as to reach out to form collaborations and to network. Today, I invite you to continue this tradition in our virtual format via Zoom chat. So, let's begin. Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences presents to you DASER Experiments, a conversation with Jody Deming and Adrien Segal.
I managed to get out of college with a minimal science degree, and I had to get work to support myself, and I landed a job as a technician in a research lab. It was actually a lab established after the Viking Mars mission, of all things. I just lucked into it. And I was sent into the lab and told to do X, Y, and Z. And I went in and I did my first experiment. It was with enzymes, actually the luciferase enzyme, which produces light. And I did this experiment where I designed the experiment and I'm watching the results come off in real time and nobody else is in the lab. It's just me doing this. And it was the most exciting thing that ever happened to me. I felt that creative juice flowing. And I thought, oh, wow, I need to be a scientist. And that's been my motivation since then, is to have this sense of creativity come out in the work that I could contribute. What I wanted to contribute something that was creative, and that still drives me, and I still try to make those opportunities available to my students so they get to experience what the individual can bring, what you can contribute if your self can be exposed to your own creativity, if you will. And where do I think that's going? I hope where that's going is creative solutions to the enormous problems we face now and in the future.
I happened upon scientific data while I was still in school during my thesis work. And the first piece I made was the tidal datum sculpture for San Francisco. And I think I just got the bug for continuing to work with scientific research and data from there. I never do the same thing every day. I get to have conversations like this and go on scientific expeditions and go to residencies in different parts of the world and meet other creative people who have other expertise in working in different ways, and just the amount and variety of interactions I get to have on a day-to-day basis. And hopefully that excitement gets expressed through the work that I make and communicates some of my ideas and the ideas of other scientists to people that maybe wouldn't necessarily be exposed to them in their normal day-to-day lives. Hi, Jody. It's really nice to meet you. It's been just a pleasure looking through some of, skimming the surface, as it were, of the research you've spent your life dedicated to, and learning about the progression you've gotten to through sea ice and studying ice on Jupiter's planets. It's just such a broad experience that you have. I guess we both have a deep curiosity about the world around us and how it got to be that way. I think that's what I've seen most commonplace between the artists and scientists I know that are working cross-disciplinary between those two fields. And then just that part of my research is going out into the world and observing, and then going back into the studio to kind of filter and curate and create something from those experiences. And I imagine it's somewhat of a similar process for you in that you go on these expeditions. How many times have you gone to the Arctic?
Well, my first trip was in '87, and I've gone once or twice or 3 times a year since then.
A lot of my work that I sent you, the sea ice pieces and the glacier pieces, were initially inspired by a residency I did in Alaska in Homer on the Ketchikan Bay, and just being there, I don't know, I think it was pretty hard not to be inspired by the landscape, and just, you can't really put your finger on what's so fascinating about the Arctic and the ocean and the landscape, but it just pulls you in, and it led to a lot of work for me too.
It definitely pulled me in, but I would say that the overwhelming sense and reason I keep going back is because it teaches me humility. The Arctic Ocean in particular is so removed from humanity, if you will, that it teaches us our place. And it also, the reason I keep going north instead of south is because there's a whole community of indigenous people who've lived there for thousands of years and who bring memories to the table that nobody else can bring to the table.
And have you been involved with a lot of the communities up there, and have they taught you much about the long-term changes in the landscape?
My most recent project brought us really close to locals in Nukiagvik, which is the northernmost point in Alaska, because they store their food in ice cellars that are buried deep, and they've begun to see seepage of brine into the bottom of their frozen ice cellars. And I'm studying that brine in the areas where it is pooled, if you will. And so we have this direct connection between my own scientific interests that have a real impact on their food security. And so the discussion is very active there. So what drove you to the Arctic in the first place?
People recommended Alaska, and they always say something like, you got to see it before you die. And whenever somebody says something like that to me, I'm like, well, why would I wait that long? I'm going to go now. So that just inspired me to just be like, all right, I should go see what this landscape and what this place is about, because it feels really far away, but it just blew me away. And the first time I went, it was just for a vacation, and took 2 weeks and drove around. And then I had visited a small gallery in the town of Homer called the Bunnell Street Art Gallery, and they have a residency program that brings artists there for a month at a time. And I applied for it and ended up going the next year, and ended up going back the next year because I was doing a public art piece. I have one of those tide sculptures that I told you about.
Oh, yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah. The first one I did was of San Francisco Bay's tide patterns. But in doing that project, I realized and learned a lot about tide patterns and how they're different all over the world. So I ended up doing several other versions of that same style of piece, but with different data sets. So one of them was for the tide patterns in the Gulf of Mexico, and one of them was the tide patterns in Homer, Alaska. So there's a sculpture hanging in the Harbor Master building in Homer that is showing the tide patterns in Kachemak Bay.
I thought that sculpture was actually extraordinary because the three-dimensionality of it really gives you a sense of the tides, all the different timings of the tides, if you will, at once. Mm-hmm. And scrolling down about your starting point with the data sets, those are so dry and so two-dimensional, and you turned it into a living three-dimensional thing that also captures time. And that's one of the things I love about interacting with artists is that you have a way of turning reality into a new reality that is even stronger.
I think that's a really rich area. And I've just in the last, 5 years or so, I've seen a lot more discussion and activity around the idea of art and science and collaborations and partnerships. And I haven't collaborated directly with any scientists as yet, because I think that there's sort of this overlap where science gets you this far and art kind of can take the reins, and the visualization and the application to the rest of society and the more creative, emotional, non-rational sides of things. Art really has this way of taking science into that realm. But I haven't seen too much where like a scientist wants to learn how to carve a sculpture. I feel like that is where the areas of expertise touch on the edges, but they don't necessarily overlap all that much. But I feel like the conversations and the interactions and the discussions about how you see the world and how I see the world and how we respond to those things in very different ways has been really, really rich for me personally. And so I've definitely enjoyed the times where I have been able to work with scientists.
I'm an emotional person. I'm a scientist. I actually bring a lot of emotion to my work. And I'm currently involved in a project that is what brought me to work closely with artists in the first place. It's called the Ocean Memory Project, where just juxtaposing those two words, ocean and memory, is stimulating to think about. But we're a collection of artists and scientists and journalists and writers and sculptors and people from all walks of discipline and practice. And what we're trying to do is discover something more than that interface that we can come to and then the artist goes with. I never had the terminology of positive and negative space. But there is so much positive and negative space in the very issues that I study. And so having that terminology given to me by an artist, because you have training that gives you that way of thinking about things, has helped me to think differently about what I'm studying. So how do you decide what subject matter to go after?
That's a really great question. Part of it is just what opportunity is in front of me. So, like I said, I applied for a residency in Alaska. That put me in the setting of, glacial landscapes. And that's when I started doing work with first glacial retreat and then sea ice patterns. Sometimes it's a residency that gives me access to new facilities, like so I can learn a new material that I haven't used before. So most of my work previously and early on has been metal and wood, mostly like kind of sculptural carving, because that's the studio I have access to and the tools I'm most proficient at using. But then if like for the sea ice pieces, that was a great opportunity where I did a residency not too far from my house in Emeryville at a glass casting facility called Bullseye. And they have kilns and materials and provided some training so I could learn how to translate my ideas about sea ice patterns into a material that more adequately expresses the aesthetic and the properties of sea ice. So glass is a really great material for that. So sometimes it's that, and then sometimes it's just learning an interesting fact or reading an interesting report in a scientific study. So I've done some work on water consumption statistics. It was first inspired by learning that the Colorado River hasn't reached the Gulf of Mexico in many, many years because we use all of the water. And that just makes me wonder, what are we using all this water for? Where does it go? And luckily there's reports that you can search out online and find on online databases. And if there's some nugget of information that really surprises me in a report, then I will definitely take that forward into a sculpture.
So you have a lot in common with scientists. Often the tools we have available to us at the time is what drives what question we get to try to address. So I study microorganisms, and they're invisible. You can't see them without a powerful microscope. So imagination is a large part of my work, I would say, I would finally acknowledge to the world. So one of what wasn't my earliest trip, but an early trip to the Arctic was in the dead of winter time. So it was minus 40 degrees centigrade, and we went out on Inuit sleds out onto the ice to drill into the ice. And being on the ice under those severe conditions was totally exuberating for me and inspirational as I tried to think about, on a completely different scale, these tiny little microbes that are living inside the pore spaces of the ice that I'm standing on, as if this ice is concrete. And it is like concrete in the wintertime when it's super cold. But they're still living in there in little brine pockets. They're still living and breathing and doing their thing. And to be in that environment with them and experience it. Okay, I'm smiling because it's a bit of an anthropogenic kind of thing, or anthropomorphic kind of thing. But it helped me to think about strategies they might have for combating super cold. Maybe they produce their own antifreeze. Turns out they do. Maybe they do some really interesting things that make it an environment for them that's perfectly normal, perfectly comfortable for them. And I think being in the environment is what led me down those idea pathways.
Earlier, you talked about the Ocean Memory Project, and I think that I wanted to know more. You've mentioned that putting those two words together was a really exciting moment, and that the ocean has memory in a lot of different ways. And I'm assuming that the microorganisms in ice is kind of one way that it has it. Do you want to talk about any of the other ways that you and the kind of interdisciplinary team you're working with are exploring the idea of ocean memory?
We're exploring lots of ideas. Where could I start? One idea that's very, very relevant today is the role of viruses in memory. So most people don't have an appreciation for this, but the ocean is filled with viruses. Most of those viruses don't infect us. They infect marine bacteria, actually. So there's this astronomical number of tiny little viruses in seawater that are infecting and not infecting bacteria in there. And the different bacteria that get infected, they carry a memory of who infected them before. It's actually encoded in their genome as to which virus infected them. and they're able to defend against a virus. They have their own little immune system, and they're able to communicate with their neighbor about what's going on. And so there are all these parallels to how marine bacteria, of all things, could teach us about holding memories and learning from memories of viral infection, and how keeping a certain physical distance from each other in seawater helps them to avoid being infected. You see all the metaphors and parallels one can draw here. We have some artists doing some amazing work in depicting networks of microorganisms and viruses interacting in a very small amount of liquid seawater, and sort of blowing that up for the world to see this universe, this tiny universe of interactions going on, the making and losing of memories by microbes.
And are there, I looked through the list of artists. I actually know Christine Lee fairly well.
Chris Lee, yeah. She's a weaver in a lot of her work, and she will weave together pieces that I never would have thought a weaver could express a scientific concept. But there it is, she does some really cool stuff.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've got there's several media that are going to be manifesting the ideas.
Yes, including acoustic art. So I'm wearing these giant headphones because I have a hearing loss and I have to deal with that. But we have some acoustic scientists, I was going to say. They are acoustic scientists, but they're musicians as well. And they create art from scientific data by sonifying it. And there's some extraordinary work being done there by Tim Weaver, for example. And there are also some art that is being generated right now that pulls it all together, that has a visual aspect to it, an audio aspect to it, a film aspect to it, and some time aspect to it, so that you can see my co-lead on this project, Daniel Kohn. He's doing some wonderful work where it's painting work, but you can watch ink flow in pre-arranged tracks on the page, but then begin to deviate and make their own memories. And there have been some wonderful juxtapositions of his type of work with the acoustic work and the film work. Your sculptures of fire, or I guess they're burned relics of forests or something. The structures and forms of those immediately reminded me of black smoker structures and lost city towers. These hydrothermal vents on the seafloor immediately reminded me of that. And when I first looked at your fire sculptures, I went the ocean memory route, which happens to me continuously now. But I thought, okay, did fire originate in the ocean? Does the ocean have a memory of fire? Fire doesn't actually happen in water. Fire happens in air. But there is superheated fluid coming out of submarine volcanoes that would burn as soon as it's exposed to air.
It was just this beautiful, we think of fires, in society, they're very destructive to human life. We build houses, they burn them down, but those fire sculptures I made that are at the show at the Academy of Sciences right now really were about rethinking, these natural processes. Wildfire is necessary for a healthy forest. It's a part of forest ecology. And can we start to think about how important that is, rather than just talking about them as deadly and destructive?
The adaptability of life in an ecosystem, in a forest ecosystem, it happens the same way.
So those fire sculptures that are in the show, they are based on geographic data. So they're literally, if you see a fire progression map, it basically shows you the perimeter of the fire over time. And when they're represented two-dimensionally, it's kind of hard to see the change over time, so the progression as the fire grows one direction to the other. So I literally just took a two-dimensional map and made time the third dimension, and that's what you see in those sculptures is, one of them kind of comes this way at first, and then it twists around and comes this way. And that one's a fire from 2003 in San Diego. And what happened was the Santa Ana winds were going one direction and it only went this way. And then something shifted and it went the totally other direction. So when you extrapolate out time, you can really see this sort of morphed map, but you can see how the fire changed and grew in area and space over time. Because again, it's back to forces that are bigger than yourself. When you stand on the edge of the ocean, you can only see the tides at that one time. Most of the scientific climate data about natural systems only go back to the 70s, because that's when satellites went up in the air and really started tracking everything. But most significant changes in the climate, you need to see more than 30 years to really get a good sense of what's going on. So I feel like we're sort of just at the brink and just digging into a long enough time frame of significant degree of scientific data to start to understand some of those longer term trends and processes.
Are you sure you're not a scientist? You might be really interested in a data set from Puget Sound. So I'm in Seattle, so I'm in that part of the West, the Pacific Northwest, and there are records in the sediment that accumulate on the seafloor of the Sound. There are records that show when there were forest fires. And so you can go back many thousands of years and see the forest fire record there, just in how the sediments are laminated and where you see the burned ash part that was washed in from forest fires. So I can imagine you doing something quite amazing with that.
I would love to see that, because you used to study sediment first, right?
I studied the deep sea first, and sediments contain the most number of microorganisms, so that was a very rich starting point for me. They're stuck in there, yeah.
When you're studying these sediments, do you do a similar thing like with an ice core? Do you take a core of that?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect analogy. In fact, we call sea ice the inverted benthos. Benthos refers to benthic dwelling organisms, bottom dwelling organisms, and we refer to sea ice as inverted benthos, because on the bottom side of sea ice is where all the algae grow, because they have nutrients from the ocean below and they have light coming from above. In the ocean, you have to turn that upside down to simulate the ocean, because the phytoplankton are blooming at the top of the ocean and everything is sinking to the bottom. So that's why we call it inverted. But we use a lot of the same methodology.
Mm. And then I'll stop with these questions, but I only get to pick people's brains who are experts so often. Really quickly, the sea ice microorganisms that you study in the liquid brine, with the changes in sea ice cover and how thick and how long they're staying, where do those sea ice brine go when the ice melts? Do they go back into the ocean and stay in the Arctic?
They go back into the seawater, and then they refreeze every winter, every fall, they start freezing again. So they go through this freeze-thaw gauntlet every year, forever, or as long as we've had cold enough weather for it to freeze in the winter time. Yeah. So there's an annual gauntlet there.
Amazing.
And the freeze-in happens frequently enough that you're still freezing in Arctic seawater. Mm-hmm. The Pacific water is flowing in through Bering Strait, and Atlantic water is flowing in from the Barents Sea on the European side. But at the surface, you have Arctic water that's freezing and refreezing all the time. So the microbes are going back and forth between ice and very cold seawater.
And they're doing fine with the increase in the ambient temperature, or are they
the microbes are doing fine. The microbes are doing fine. Other things are not doing fine, but microbes are eminently adaptable.
Yeah, they're very, very adaptable. But let's hope we can be like them.
I was just going to say humans should be as adaptable as microbes. We should learn from them and do our best to adapt to all the things we really need to change and adapt to.
Yeah. It has been so lovely talking to you.
Oh, it's been great. Obviously, we could keep going. It's wonderful. Great to meet you. We'll have to arrange to spend more time together.
Yeah, and please do. I'll keep following the Ocean Memory Project, but I would love to see how that keeps going. And so just the couple of projects you've touched on that the artists are kind of working on sounds so fascinating.
Yeah. It's been inspirational, just like your own work. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Well, hello, this is JD Talasek, Director of Cultural Programs. I'm going to invite Jody and Adrien to turn their videos on and their audio on. And first of all, let me just say thank you. What a stimulating discussion that was, and I look forward to continuing it now with some of the questions that are coming in. We're going to try to get to as many of these as we possibly can, but as everyone can see, there's just a lot of curiosity and engagement. Jody and Adrien, I wonder if I could just start by asking you, now that you've kind of seen the recording of the discussion that we had a few days ago, are there any things that you would like to add or clarify or expand on? Or if not, that's fine as well.
I wish we could have had another couple hours just to talk, because it was so fascinating. I just felt like it took a really natural progression.
Well, this
totally agree.
Yeah, well, this is a gift, because now we have another half hour, so we can engage with some. I think there's like over 200 people that have logged on during the discussion, and we're really glad to see them. And I apologize to everyone who's attending that we had a little bit of a glitch at the beginning. We did not provide access to you to communicate to everyone that's attending, and now it is. So in the spirit of an experiment, this is how we learn. So thank you very much. So let's just kind of jump into some of these questions. I think, you know, one of the questions I think was more directed towards Adrien, but I'll ask both of you, is like, what is the reaction that you've received? What response has your work received? And do you think those reactions change based on age, scientific, or environmental awareness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've received a wide range of response to the work, and what I find so wonderful about it is that you don't always know what people are responding to, because art is inherently a bit abstract, so people kind of read into it what they want to, and that's a beautiful moment. And so I have received emails from scientists, some of whom I'm using their data, and that's always been a really wonderful response. I've mostly been positive, of just excitement about seeing some of their research and data get out into the world in a totally unexpected, different format than they probably imagined it would. I can't say that I've seen a difference in response in terms of like age or scientific expertise. What I do like is that the work that I make is intended to be an evocative, interesting object or artifact or representation on its own. And I like that that is open enough that people who might be interested in woodworking can be drawn in from that point of view and then be exposed to the scientific information behind it. So I try to see the work as bridging the gaps between fields. And that doesn't always work, but it's nice when it does. And then on the other side, sometimes people who are already familiar with some of the patterns that I'm representing will know what the data set is in the piece without being told. So the tides piece is specifically surfers and sailors and anyone who knows the shape of a tide chart know instantaneously what that sculpture is conveying. And for people who don't know on their own, I usually title the work referring to the data set so that there's kind of a clue that they can figure out what it is. And then someone had asked about where they can look at more information. My website has all of the process of from the start of finding the data and how it's translated into a sculpture with kind of sketching and model making and really sometimes playing around with how that data can be represented in different ways. And so I usually will present the work with some book or additional information showing from start to finish the entire process that led to the sculptural representation.
Adrien, as someone who has installed your work at the National Academy of Sciences, your attention to detail, Jody's observation during the conversation of you having the science leanings is well-deserved. And so your website is also very rich in that information as well. And it's definitely worth checking out. I think Alana may have just added that to the chat room. Jody, there were several questions that were very similar, but targeted towards you, specifically towards the Ocean Memory Project. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit in the same way about what has been the public response to the Ocean Memory Project, or has there been opportunities for that response?
So we're relatively new as an Ocean Memory Project group. I have to apologize for some side noise going on here. So we've been working together to cross disciplines and bridge the gaps between each other so that we come to some sort of consensus view of our vision and how we're going forward here. We've been doing a lot of work at that level. But we're also, some of us are also teaching ocean memory. And this whole shutdown business has taught me to become a Zoom teacher. And one of the things that I would really love to do and have a way to do is to generate curricula, that online, open access, free curricula on this ocean memory concept. And not just the science concept of it, but the whole thing, the science, art, humanities interaction. I think it would be an excellent teaching tool. I saw a number of questions come in the chat room I didn't have time to answer about teaching opportunities, because the ocean memory concept brings together just about everything. You can find your subject matter in the ocean, whether you realize that or not. For example, I also saw some questions about viruses in the ocean, which I could address later if we want, but for the moment, where the Ocean Memory Project is headed is to expanding our footprint so that more people become aware of us and can participate with us. And I think from my perspective as both a scientist and an educator, that ways to educate using ocean memory as a concept would be very exciting and expanding for us.
Jody, I think now would be a great time, if you don't mind expanding a little bit more on the ocean viruses, that you were talking about briefly.
The questions were coming a little quickly for me to take in everything, but there was one question about viral lifetime in ice, or a couple of questions about that. So we need to make a distinction between sea ice and glacial ice. So sea ice freezes from the ocean, and it doesn't last, but most of it lasts a year, and then it melts in the summertime. Some of it lasts multiple years, but not centuries or millennia. Whereas glacial ice, like on Greenland and Antarctica, which is formed from fresh water, from deposition of snow, that ice can last for millennia. And inside that ice, you do have preserved microbes and viruses. And so there is some interest in seeing what's held in that glacial ice over time. Viruses do have a lifetime, and it depends on the virus and the circumstances. But for example, the viruses I know about in the Arctic Ocean, they can persist for weeks if it's cold enough and salty enough in their environment. In the rest of the warmer ocean, their lifetimes are very short, minutes. So we don't have to worry about viruses, and those viruses in the ocean are not infecting us. I just one more point is connecting viruses to the Ocean Memory Project. You might not think that the ocean holds a memory of viruses, but it certainly does. Viruses originated in the ocean, even coronaviruses, which COVID-19 is based on an RNA virus, and they originated in the ocean a long time ago.
Good, Jody. There's a number of questions about how to get involved in the Ocean Memory Project. There's also questions about, where can they find more of the artists that are represented. And I think the answer to that in part is that, as you said, this is a new project. So not everything is on the website, and it's not completely inclusive at this point as the work you're doing. Is that accurate, Jody? Is that an accurate thing to say, or is there a place where the artists can be
each of our artists that are currently involved have their own websites that are much more extensive than the Ocean Memory Project website. So please pursue their websites. You'll find their work there that they're pursuing from the perspective of ocean memory. But yes, we're a new project, and our funding is to explore the concept and see how to expand it. So we're at that stage.
Right, good, fantastic. So this question was directed towards Jody, but I think it applies to both of you. Is that the comments on Adrien's pieces that you made, Jody, you found some parallels in the thought processes, research, gathering background info between the both of you. What value do you see in encouraging young scientists to be more creative? And I might also flip that question for Adrien is, what benefit would it be to educate young artists to look towards science for inspiration and ideals, and ideal iteration?
I think I would reinforce kind of what Jody said during the talk, that science and art aren't quite as different as we perceive them to be in society, and that creativity is a absolutely essential for scientists to do the work that they do. And like she said, imagination is a huge part of scientific research. So I think that it's already there. I think that what science could maybe gain, either through partnerships, collaborations, or just encouraging more artistic and scientific back and forth, is the communication of ideas in visual or physical forms, so that the science lives beyond the paper that gets published, and can be communicated to a really broad audience. From the artist side, I think artists could obviously do a lot more scientific research, but artists tend to stick to whatever inspiration they have, and they all kind of are working in different areas. But I do think the partnerships and collaborations that really engage both science and arts, and the galleries and museums that represent artists as sort of a mediator for the exhibition of the work, can really make strong partnerships that get the ideas and the work of both artists and scientists out to a much broader audience.
For my part, I'd really like to see art, the interface between art and science, and the way that artists can depict science brought to the K through 12 level as much as possible. Sometimes scientists, or often scientists, are put in this box that we are a certain way, we do a certain type of things, and we're not accessible. And that's not the case, or we don't wish to be inaccessible. We wish to be accessible. We wish the knowledge that we generate to be common knowledge and understood by a lot of people, everyone. And you have to start at an early level with that. And the interface with art is superb in training children into thinking in other ways than they might be led to think by their regular daily life. So I think there's a lot of power in this interface for education and making science a more common part of every person's life, which I think today's issue shows us.
Thank you for that. This next question kind of builds on that, but is one that we're often thinking about. Have either of you used the combination of art and science to inform and influence political decision makers? Or I'll even like expand that. Do you see the possibility of this? I mean, just thinking in the times of where we are right now and what the role of art and integrative work is in this time of pandemic. Can you see the potential if you haven't already done this?
I see potential, but I don't know if we're quite there yet on the art side. I think people, I don't have any direct connections to like political influence in this age. Jody, maybe you probably have more of a.
I've had some influence, not much, but some influence, but not yet at the art-science interface, but it's coming very quickly, I think. For example, my senior graduate student, Max Showalter, he has taken an interest in the Ocean Memory Project. He develops our newsletter for us, and he's also got a very strong interest in policy. So when he leaves the University of Washington, he's going out there to have some influence on the policy level, and he will have had this exposure, full exposure to the art-science interface. So sorry to be focusing too much on you, Max, but there's potential when you educate people at this interface for them to run with it and help at the policy level. So I think there's great potential there.
Right. Right. Especially, I mean, that's, I guess there's other questions that kind of expand on that is like, what is the potential of Ocean Memory Project to become sort of its own area of study? Is that one of the goals of the Ocean Memory Project? And if so, what form do you see that taking?
It's definitely one of the goals. And our project is quite diverse. I think it's fair to say individuals within the project have their own views of particular goals. My particular goal would be, well, I have many too, but as a scientist, one goal is to bring ocean memory into the scientific methodology, because I think there are ways to bring human cognition, the concept of memory, human memory, which every single person understands because we all experience memory and loss of memory. Bring that concept and ways of studying human cognition, algorithms and terminology and methodology, apply that to ocean science. And I think we will discover things in the ocean that we haven't yet discovered because we're not thinking along those lines. So yes, I'm very keen on establishing a new line of research in this area of scientific research. But for me personally, I would not be able to engage in that new line without also having a panoply of other types of people right along with me.
You know, there is, as I've just come to expect in these types of gatherings, there's everyone is very much enthusiastic about the ideals, but then it becomes the question of funding and some of the obstacles, you know, to cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary work. And you know, this has been addressed, probably not to any sort of true satisfaction or true answer, but what are some of the challenges that you see as far as art and science discussion? And that might be funding. It might also be sort of what challenges do we find in academia to structures within our school systems? What has been your experiences as far as your institutions welcoming this type of discussion between disciplines?
That's a good question. The Art College, California College of the Arts that I teach at is very, very receptive to science collaborations, and they've pushed for it. But as an art and design school, they do not have in-house any sorts of scientific research happening. specifically in the school. So I think they would need to partner across universities to be able to have a more meaningful, ongoing, like in-depth endeavor towards that. At a liberal arts college, I bet it would probably be a bit easier to do because it's all in-house. But I also I've been involved in a project up in Canada that was a very successful collaborative project that I think set a really good standard for how these kinds of partnerships can happen. And what was wonderful about it was because it was a university, the University of Lethbridge partnered with an art gallery, the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, which is in town, and then also partnered with an agricultural center. So the agricultural center was where they have researchers that they had provide data. The art school, the university was the ones who connected a bunch of artists, myself included. This is some of the work that's in the show at the National Academy of Sciences. And then the gallery was the one who kind of did the presentation and the exhibition. And that trifecta partnership was super successful because it covered all bases. An agricultural center is not going to know how to effectively show the work that's produced as that collaboration. The university could show it, but they needed an offsite kind of space that's familiar with how to show work, and the whole project culminated in a big exhibition at the art museum, which was phenomenal and very well attended in the town. And I think that those kinds of partnerships that bring across, that bring energies together and really have all entities working towards a singular goal really help to get the work out in a really effective way. And I have been approached by different scientists at different times who are interested in showing my work, like at a science conference. And science conferences typically just don't have the right setting to show artwork with. And so I think that's why the partnership with an intermediary that's familiar with how art exists in the world can really help everyone just have a more successful experience with those kinds of collaborations. So I kind of got off topic in terms of not just within an academic institution, but I think what I'm saying is that partnering outside of academic institutions is really important too. I'm essentially just an independent artist. I work for myself, and I happen to really be interested in scientific research, and I will seek out the scientists I want to work with and cold email them or find data just online. So not everyone's going to work that way, but the stronger those partnerships can be, academic, professional, and independent, I think really make the whole presentation of projects like this stronger. Jody, I'm sure you have something to...
Yes, I do. I'd like to add 2 points actually. And it goes back to the Ocean Memory Project, but a very strong partner for us is the Jurassic Artist Residence Program near Santa Cruz, in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And they have, Margot Knight, I believe, is on with us today. She runs the place. And they have a science art program there that nurtures this interface. And they are dependent on philanthropy to move forward. That question has come up many times. How do we fund this type of thing? They are dependent on philanthropy. And in the science world, to bring art into it, wow, that's a tough one too. But I think that the Ocean Memory Project can make some serious headway here. A simple example is that my School of Oceanography at UW is excited to put on an art exhibit based on ocean memory. And we were all set. We had some of the artwork shipped out, and then the pandemic hit. So we haven't figured out how we're going forward with that yet. But the level of excitement at the administrative level for seeing an art exhibit in a science building was terrific. So that's like a seed for planting the idea that there could be eventually funds to go in this direction. But, you know, the funding thing is always tough.
Jody, can I ask you a question? I've talked to some scientists who, within their budgets for a project, have to do some kind of outreach. Have you seen that they can legitimately justify, you know, like funding an art component through that outlet?
I'm not sure I have seen that, but I have to think it exists. Most of the outreach type efforts are more on the education side because that's so many scientists are also teachers. So oh, that's a great question. We should open that up. We should make that happen. I can say that some oceanographic vessels often bring artists on board. Yeah, that's true. And so from that perspective, they bring artists on board who capture what's going on. And then, for example, Rebecca Rutstein with us and Daniel Kohn have all been to sea. Anna Davidson has been to sea, been on research vessels and created art as a result of it. So yeah, that's happening. And the ocean makes that very easy to happen because it's such a creative space for science and art.
Thank you, Jody and Adrien. I've got two questions that I'm going to read at the same time because they're somewhat related, and you can respond accordingly. And regretfully, this may be the last question that we have time for. So the first question is, what's your opinion about the notion that artists, like the Impressionists, intuitively find answers to things like cognition before the scientific environment has evolved to address those questions? And the second, which is a very different question, but just for the sake of getting it on record, would you be interested, Jody, in talking about the difference between history and memory, specifically the dynamic and forward-looking nature of memory? Lots of yes. I'm sort of trying to do a free for all and catch some of these brilliant concepts and questions that are coming in. But if basically, I guess, you know, there's the two questions is, are artists able to, you know, find answers to some of the questions that scientists are looking for before they are, because they're not restricted by certain ways of approaching the question. And then also just, you know, I guess, Jody, to sort of expand a little bit more on in that way, what memory is, as opposed to in the context of maybe history.
Yeah, so we are wrestling with that concept directly in the Ocean Memory Project, because there's a whole field called paleoceanography that looks at the history of events that are recorded in ocean sediments, for example, or in glacial ice. But history is the recording of information, but memory is the additional ability to recall that information and anticipate something coming in the future. That's what humans do. We keep certain memories. We don't keep all our memories. We prune them every night when we sleep, but we keep important critical memories to anticipate some threat coming in the future or some change in our condition coming in the future, so we'll know how to defend ourselves and survive that new set of conditions. So applying that to the ocean, it's easy to do that if you talk about life in the ocean, because life is easier to envision as having memory. Even microbial life, which is not a neuronal system like the human brain, but they can interact as neurons and create their own memories. So the difference between history and memory is critical. History is an essential part of memory, but memory takes it the next step. And if there are things that are memories held by the ocean that we could learn about that help us to see how to go forward, for example, the whole issue of ocean acidification that's happening with climate change. There are parts of the ancient ocean and the present ocean that are acidic, with organisms that know how to deal with that. So can we learn something from those memories that are held by life in the ocean? Maybe I should give Adrien a chance. I forget the first question now.
Yeah, well, the first one, just to sort of interpret it in light of what you just said, Jody. I mean, I think the question is, can artists intuitively lead us to find answers to scientific, before the scientific environment, or I might add, just outside of the scientific structure. What the intuitive process? I mean, that's really I guess what the question is getting to.
Yeah. So I would have to have some time to think if I know of an example where an artist came up with an answer before the scientist did. I'm relatively new to the art-science interface, but I can definitely tell you that artists intuit things fabulously. And the whole existence of the Ocean Memory Project is because an artist, Daniel Kohn, just turned around to the scientists in the room and said, well, does the ocean have memory? And it was like, bingo, wow. Everything I've done my whole career was actually about memory in the ocean, but I didn't have those two words to think about it. So this Ocean Memory Project is on a trajectory now driven by artist intuition in a science direction for me. So that's coming. That's an example that's coming. Fascinating question, though, if artists have come up with an answer before scientists. I want to think a lot about that.
Yeah.
I
Adrien, any final words?
Yeah, I've got, there's a quote I really love by Anton Chekhov. He's a Russian playwright, that the role of the artist is to ask questions, not to answer them. And I think that kind of rings true here, that artists aren't necessarily looking for the same kind of answers that scientists might be. But I do think there's a lot of examples from scientific discoveries where the scientist wasn't looking where they thought they were looking for something specific, and they ended up figuring out something totally unexpected. So even if you are looking for a specific answer, that might not necessarily be what you find. You might end up answering or discovering a whole nother thing. You know, the more you know, the more you don't know is another kind of way. So I don't think that artists necessarily are finding answers to things that scientists aren't. I do think that artists just think a very different way than scientists do overall. And I don't know if this is an apt analogy, but Jody used to play and still plays the piano. And I bring that up because there are many different types of memory, and muscle memory is one of them. So it's not only cognitive memory that we're talking about. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize. Memory doesn't only happen in the mind. And I think Chris Lee talks a little bit about this too in her artwork that she's doing for the Ocean Memory Project. So thinking about like how else we store and recall important, actions and information that comes out in ways that are not fully when you might not be conscious of them. Like when you play the piano, you can practice it a few times, and it's a much more cognitive act in the beginning because you're reading the notes. But after a while, the practice leads for you to your hands know how to play it even before your mind does. And that's a really important thing. And I do feel that in my own way when I'm carving or sculpting or working with tools. Like there is a memory to using your body, an embodied knowledge that is really, really important. And I think that if we can shift the way we think about cognition and thinking as something more broad, that starts to encompass art and science in the same conversation, as opposed to just thinking about what happens in your brain.
That's just wonderful, Adrien, and it made me think about the indigenous peoples of the North, the Inuit who live in the North. They use art, they use sculpture and carving as a way to tell their stories and their science, their knowledge of the environment. So there's an example of people who know how to find, express, and create new knowledge through art. They've got the two things going together already. They're ahead of us.
Thank you both. The idea of muscle memory and embodied learning is a whole nother discussion. So maybe we just need to start at that point during another event. Jody, Adrien, thank you for being a part of our first online DASER experiment. To those in the audience, to answer your question, yes, we will be preserving the transcripts, the chat room, lots of wonderful people sharing who they are and where they're from. I was able to see people logged in from Rome, from India, and our dear friends from Brazil, Fia Cruz. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sure there are others that I haven't mentioned. There will be a survey coming out soon, and hopefully in that survey we'll give you more instructions on how to find the recording of the video as well as the transcripts. But we also, we really want to embrace the fact that we're calling these DASER experiments. We've learned a lot of things already just from this morning being online, and we look forward to getting your feedback as well. So please do take some time to respond to the surveys, and each DASER that we do, we'll build on it and learn from it and improve it. But for right now, Jody, Adrien, again, thank you so much for bringing your time, your talents, your thoughts, and your energy to this experiment. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.